This was wild. Natasha Hausdorf went to the UK House of Commons Foreign Committee and absolutely educated the entire committee one by one. She took question after question and educated every single one of them. Check out this video. It's a little long, but we're going to go through it. I'll give some commentary when necessary.
If I was targeting...
Oh, no.
So
why? No. That's an extraordinary allegation.
May I finish the question? May I finish the answer?
Be careful what you're saying.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. No, I've come here in good faith to answer questions, and from the moment I walked in the room, I've been barracked and told to be quiet when I've been trying to answer questions. I will answer this one with your permission.
So your future for Israel is a fairly positive one. The economy doing well, being at peace with its neighbours, dealing with the Iranian threat and the threat from Iranian proxies. That's one side. And so I suppose the other side, given that we're looking at peace for Israel and Palestine, is what would be the future of a Palestinian living in Gaza? What would be the future of a Palestinian living on the West Bank?
I think that ultimately depends on whether the international community continues down the tried and tested mechanism of encouraging extremism, unfortunately, amongst Palestinian terrorist groups. We've seen that vis-à-vis Hamas, we've seen that vis-à-vis Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, elements of the so-called moderates in the West Bank. Until and unless the two driving factors of the worsening situation for the Palestinians, namely indoctrination to terror and incentivization to terror, until those are addressed and until international complicity in those issues and the perpetuation of the conflict through that is addressed, my projection, if you will, or my hopes for a similar positive reality are less optimistic. It's one of the reasons I've made it a significant mission travelling around the world and meeting with politicians and officials to stress the importance of ceasing funding for UNRWA, which is at the core...
Wait, sorry, may I just so that I get this. So if I was a Palestinian mother in Gaza or on the West Bank, I would be looking to... my future would be what? It all depends on whether the West are helping to... develop extremism within Hamas?
Well, I think the future of any Palestinian in Gaza ultimately depends on whether or not Hamas is defeated, right. Which is, of course, one of Israel's central war aims.
Okay, but you're quite confident that Israel is going to be successful, that Israel is going to defeat Iran and Iranian proxies. So then the question is, what happens then? What does peace look like for Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza? I'm sorry I keep asking, I just want an answer to that.
I think I put it in terms of being cautiously optimistic.
What does cautiously optimistic mean?
Well, cautiously optimistic, I don't say that it is easy to defeat Iranian threats, in particular where one sees the international community moving to policies of appeasement and complacency in grappling with these threats.
Yeah, let's get away from those sorts of words. Yes. Let's just talk about what's the future. So you're saying there's a positive future, you're optimistic. So what's the optimistic, positive future for a Palestinian mother in Gaza at the moment or on the West Bank? What's the best thing that could happen?
The best thing that could happen is the ending of the indoctrination and the incentivization to terror, to give ordinary Palestinians a chance. And through that, I think the removal...
What does a chance look like? What does it mean?
Through the removal of the genocidal Islamist regime in Gaza and the corrupt Palestinian Authority.
I'm so sorry. What does a chance look like? Let's take away all the words. Let's take away all of those descriptions. Let's keep ourselves calm.
Let me give you a practical
and this is my last try. What does a positive future look like for Palestinians living in Gaza or on the West Bank? What's the best thing we can hope for?
Perhaps I can give you a practical example. When I've visited Ramallah, the biggest cause for optimism I have seen is looking a visit to a venture capital startup fund, looking to create Silicon Valley, a startup culture in the West Bank, in Ramallah, specifically looking to create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society that can hold its corrupt leadership to account. Mahmoud Abbas, let's not forget, is in the 20th year of his 4-year term. The oppression, the brutal oppression, it's remarkable that there hasn't been more international media attention on the torture that the Palestinian Authority metes out to political opponents in the West Bank. That, if you ask me, and it's reflected in polls across the West Bank by Palestinian organisations, that has ultimately got to be the biggest prospect for the chance that I'm talking about.
Okay, well, the public will have heard your answers to my questions and will decide themselves whether you answered it. John.
Can I come to what you described as one of your missions, which is to combat the weaponisation, I think you said, of international law?
Yes.
I read your speech about the legal basis for settlements in the West Bank, in which you made the case that Israel's borders were set in 1948, and in international law that should still be the position. But you also said that was not the position as determined by the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and most other commentators. Given that, how can you continue to maintain that in international law Israel is not in breach through settlements in the West Bank?
Because I consider, as a legal professional, my first duty to be to the rule of law and to upholding international law. And one cannot have a general rule, such as uti possidetis juris, which you referenced. This is this customary rule of international law, which is universally applicable as a default rule. And its application to Israel's formation on the 14th of May 1948. I have, in a decade of discussing this with leading academics around the world, I have yet to hear a single reason why it would not apply. We can certainly go into some of the detail of that.
Can I interrupt you? Because you set out the argument quite clearly in your speech, and
I'm sorry, I'm not sure which speech you're referring to.
I'm afraid I can't give you the precise date, but anyway,
Yes.
What you're talking about is exactly the.
He can't give her the speech that he's quoting her. He can't provide her the literal speech that he's grilling her about.
The case you put at that time, and I understand that. What I don't understand is that almost all international legal bodies take a different view, and why should that be? When you argue that the case in legal terms is very clear.
So, despite about a decade of seeking to get to the bottom of a plausible reason why this would be disapplied, this default rule, to Israel's formation in 1948, I have yet to encounter one. What has been presented so far is essentially predicated on the Partition Resolution of 1947, which is a General Assembly resolution, and political resolution, not legally binding, which made a recommendation which was never implemented. So that does not, I'm afraid, displace a default rule of customary international law, which has been applied from the 19th century through to the dissolution of the former communist federations, and indeed to any state emerging from a mandate. And justice.
Can I just cut across you just for a moment? So your position essentially is that since the British mandate was all of the land up to the river in 48, that Israel is the whole of that area as well.
Well, of course, the original mandate was far bigger.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
So let's not go into past history. Let's just try and stick.
Well,
wait a minute.
To the question, it is important because this rule applies to the administrative lines of the mandate. The administrative line that had previously divided Transjordan, what later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, from the rest of the mandate, is the line that ran all the way down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea.
Yes.
And that, under this universal customary rule, that is the only line in play when Israel declares independence.
So that's where I wanted to start, right?
Yes.
So that's your position. Now, the question is, though, it's not the position, because we've not heard from the Israeli government. But it's not the Israeli government's position, is it?
The Israeli government has...
The Israeli government position is not that Israel's borders go from the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, is it?
May I take a moment to answer, because you are skipping through decades of history and policy.
But what I want to do is just because we're missing the Israeli government here, I just want to make sure that I haven't missed something.
Well,
I mean, it's not the Israeli government's position that Israel begins at the River Jordan and finishes at the Mediterranean Sea, is it?
I'm not here to represent the Israeli government.
No, I just want to make sure that I've got that.
I'm speaking to the application of international law, real international law, that is universal.
Which the Israeli government is not applying.
Well, that's not accurate. And if I may be permitted to answer the question, perhaps the committee will follow the response.
I just have to interrupt. This woman, the woman that's questioning her, is not only hostile. She actually reminds me of Umbridge. If you follow Harry Potter, it's the woman in pink who is very, very passive aggressive. So she won't outright scream at you, but she'll be like, excuse me, well, what were you saying there? She'll cough and be extremely, extremely passive aggressive to everybody. And this is exactly what this woman is exhibiting here. She's an absolute, excuse my language, an absolute bitch. She is an absolute bitch.
What Posidetis Juris does is it tells us the starting point. This is the position in 1948. It is in fact endorsed by all subsequent agreements. The armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan in 1949, and later on also the peace agreements, only refer back to those mandatory lines, administrative lines of the British Mandate. That is significant. What happens in 1967 when Israel recovers the relevant territory, the disputed territory that had previously been under Jordanian occupation? This is the parts of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, is that it treated those territories differently. The Israeli government applied its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to East Jerusalem. And critically, Abba Evan, who was the foreign minister at the time, writes to the UN Secretary General in 1967 and says this is not annexation.
Exactly.
Which is because one cannot annex what is already one's own sovereign territory.
That was brilliant. She said it's not annexation. So the other woman thinks that she's admitting that Israel is doing something wrong. So she's like, exactly. And then she's like, because you cannot annex your own territory. Oh, that's great.
So if you're asking, asking me, forgive me, the question was, what is Israel's position? That was Israel's position in 1967. Since then, of course, in pursuit of this land for peace formula, Israel anticipated that peace with Jordan would be achieved by giving Jordan some of the West Bank. So a temporary administration was instituted in Judea and Samaria. Now, that peace with Jordan, when it eventually came along in 1994, didn't include land to Jordan because it no longer wanted anything to do with that territory. So that temporary administration lasted until the Oslo Accords, which I'd already referenced in relation to the absence of ICC jurisdiction. But critically, the Oslo Accords created the Palestinian autonomy in areas A and B, but they did not change the status of the territory, the underlying status of the territory. That has always been a matter that the parties and international backers have agreed was a matter for final status negotiations.
Exactly, so and it is yet to be, and it is so it is not. So your answer is that Israel has not stated that the Israel begins at Jordan and ends at the sea.
Forgive me. Israel does not need to state that, and
well, it doesn't.
You're equating, I'm afraid, two very, very different things here. What is the legal status of the territory? And let me be clear: uti possidetis juris is a default rule that applies automatically, whatever Israel says or not.
Or anyone else in the world says.
Unless
in international law.
Yes, because when the International Court of Justice talked about the emergence of this rule in Burkina Faso, Mali, in the 1980s, it talked about the reasons for its emergence: clean lines, stability, certainty, avoiding fratricidal struggles, all of these issues which uniquely, I would say, it's disapplication here for no reason that can be discerned in international legal analysis, has unfortunately generated all of those issues that the ICJ said this rule had emerged to obviate.
Okay,
now,
hang on, let me just
I just finish the answer to this question because it's critically important. Israel has not, when it declared independence, it did not reference borders. It simply talked about Eretz Israel. It is not required for Israel to claim that uti possidetis juris arises or applies, and I'm not making a case on or in any way on behalf of the Israeli government. This is simply my analysis as to what the international legal position is, which is, I believe, what I was asked to attend today to provide.
Okay, so can I just stop you there, because there'll be some more questions for you.
Thank you. So I think it's just coming on to the crux of the question that you've answered there. What makes the UN Security Council, the ICC, the ICJ, all the esteemed lawyers there in their advisory positions, every British government since 1967, pretty much every international legal authority, they've all stated that the settlements in the occupied territories are legal, and yet your position is different. What makes you better than all of these other lawyers that we've heard from, who perhaps, in your view, don't understand real international law? What makes your position? Why should we hear your position as different and unique to theirs?
I've never suggested that I'm in any way better, but until and unless I am presented with an argument that makes it clear that this is the wrong application of international law, as opposed to what the UN and what these international courts and tribunals have consistently done, with some exceptions, I'm minded to say. There was the dissent that I mentioned from Sebutinde. In relation to the ICC, in fact, in 2021, there was also a very powerful dissent by Judge Kovacs. So I would...
Can I intervene here? Natasha, do you agree then that the occupations are not legal? The annexation is not legal, yes or no?
No, it's not a yes or no, because one cannot annex what is one's own sovereign territory. So the term annexation is misplaced here. Likewise, the term occupation, because when Israel recovered that territory... Let me give you a parallel example, which I know members of the committee will be familiar with. Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine's borders were settled by uti possidetis juris. If Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia, in the same way that Israel recovered the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and East Jerusalem from Jordan.
That's assuming that Israel owns that piece of land to start off with.
Well, yes, but I'm saying the same rules have to apply.
Can I come on to a different question, Natasha?
May I just finish the answer?
And I've got a different question.
The same rules have to apply.
Quite limited on time, I'm so sorry.
5 minutes until the next speaker. So on Palestinian recognition...
She asked the question, got absolutely destroyed and schooled, and then said, I have a different question, actually. It's brilliant.
And whether they are entitled to a state. Simple yes-no question. Do you believe that the Palestinians are entitled to a state?
Self-determination does not give one a right to a state in international law.
That's a no.
But would you like to understand why?
I'd like to know from you whether Natasha Hausdorf believes that the Palestinians have the right to a state.
I have explained that the Palestinians already have self-determination and an autonomy.
Not self-determination.
There is no right to a state is not according to international law.
No, thank you.
We simply don't.
Beautiful, beautiful. Finally, somebody said it. The Palestinians have no right to their own state. 100% correct. Sorry, you've been acting pretty bad recently. You haven't really been such good actors. You've been committing a lot of atrocities recently, killing a lot of people, a lot of innocent people. So sorry, no state. Every time we give you a state, you elect a corrupt or a terrorist government. You literally pay terrorists to commit acts against Jews, whether that's the Palestinian Authority, whether that's Hamas in Gaza. You suck. You really just suck. You're just bad. So no state for you.
I don't know what that is because it is not in the public domain, but I would say that the two entities I'm aware of that Israel has shared elements of sensitive intelligence of this nature with, the UK government and the US government, have consistently said they do not have concerns about Israel's approach to international humanitarian law so far as targeting...
Oh, no.
So why?
No. That's an extraordinary allegation.
May I finish the question? May I finish the answer?
Be careful what you're saying.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. No, I've come here in good faith to answer questions, and from the moment I walked in the room, I've been barracked and told to be quiet when I've been trying to answer questions. I will answer this one with your permission.
Please answer this question accurately
Yes.
and with care.
The UK and the US have consistently said that so far as targeting and proportionality, which is what your question pertains to, there are not concerns. There have been other concerns raised on the basis of incorrect information. If we have time to discuss detention and aid, we certainly can. But even the United Kingdom, and I'm afraid the Foreign Secretary has had to walk back some unfortunate remarks in the past, but so far as targeting and proportionality is concerned, there have not been concerns raised on the contrary.
Why is it, therefore, that Britain is not selling arms to Israel that can be used in Gaza? Is it not on the basis that there is a risk of a breach of humanitarian law?
I might ask.
No, that's not why they're not selling arms. The reason why they're not selling arms is because they're cowards. They're scared that their populace, which is probably a lot of Islamists and a lot of people that hate Israel, are going to overthrow their government and say, no, we're not going to vote for you unless you stop selling arms to Israel. So it has nothing to do with what Israel is actually doing on the ground, and only simply to do with the current state of political affairs in Britain.
This committee to look into that very question, because there is no nexus between the concerns that this government has raised on detention and aid and the arms that have been embargoed. There is a very great concern I have that absent a nexus, because of the absence of concerns on proportionality and targeting, that is not a decision that can in fact be lawful. And it is one that has clearly upended the licensing regulations in this country, which certainly has impacts quite outside of the scope of this committee's inquiry, but that are very significant to the UK's ability to export arms confidently to other countries.
I think when you appeared before a parliamentary committee, House of Commons committee, this time last year, the Business and Trade Committee, you were talking at that time, and this was prior to the UK's arms embargo on Israel, when the UK was still supplying arms. At that time, you were having to defend Israel's action around distinction and proportionality. And at the time you did it by way of talking about Hamas figures, for Hamas-run health ministry figures, and was suggesting that they are overinflated, perhaps one-third greater than your recognised figures. My question is, does Israel have figures on civilians killed in Gaza?
No, for the very simple reason that it is not targeting civilians. And therefore, there have been numbers that the Israelis have put out on the terrorists that it knows that it is eliminated, which, if you think about it logically, makes sense because it is targeting these individuals. We do actually address in my written submission to the committee, which I would ask you all to look at, the detail of the problems with the Hamas statistics, which have been repeated deeply carelessly, in my respectful opinion, and that do need to be criticised. I mean, Hamas has also revised them down subsequently, but there are figures, for example, from the Al-Akhli hospital strike in October 2023, which have not been revised, even though it's clear now that the hospital was never struck and that, in fact, it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell in the car park of the hospital. Now, that example is in and of itself critical because it indicates that these figures that Hamas have been putting out and the world have been parroting do not make clear distinctions. They do not indicate the difference between combatants and civilians. They do not indicate how the individuals are said to have been killed. And we also know that Hamas have been shooting their own civilians and that their rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip. They kill indiscriminately. They do not come with warnings like Israeli strikes. They do not come with a proportionality analysis. So on that basis, I'm afraid, the continued use of these false statistics are deeply problematic. But according to the numbers that Israel has released, even taking a number of those Hamas statistics at face value, the civilian to combatant casualty ratio, and this is setting aside the issues with the inflation of these figures by Hamas, is in the region of 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1. And that is remarkable for the sort of urban armed conflict that Israel is grappling with. When one considers the global average that is put out by the United Nations, that is at 9 to 1. With the American health authorities' statistics in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're looking at 3 to 1 and 5 to 1. And when one considers that Hamas's modus operandi here is to increase the civilian casualties as much as it can, and plainly to lie about the casualty figures when it cannot, I'm sorry to put it in these terms, but we're short on time, when it cannot secure sufficient numbers of its civilian population and their demise, because that is its main aim here, which is truly tragic for the Palestinians involved. When it cannot do that, it is falsifying the figures. So those are some of the reasons we need to be very, very careful. May I just...
We're running out of time, and I've got two people who still want to ask questions. If you don't mind, can I move on to Afra, and then I'll move to Alex, but we're 5 minutes over already, so...
Thank you. Thanks for the depth of covering your answers. I won't ask about proportionality because I think we've covered that quite fully now. I wanted to move on to talk about the law in relation to Hamas and really thinking through, does international humanitarian law, in your view, adequately address the challenges posed by non-state actors like Hamas in a modern warfare situation where, or is it possible that reforms might be needed to clarify what the obligations and accountability are of those non-state actors?
Well, unfortunately, it does not. It simply works on the basis that armies facing each other in non-asymmetric contexts will apply the laws of armed conflict because there's a mutual benefit to that. And so, frankly, the whole framework of international humanitarian law fails when you have terrorist groups like ISIS, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, that are using the laws of war against law-abiding moral militaries like the UK and like Israel. And in Israel's case, Hamas knows that Israel is upholding a much higher standard of international humanitarian law than any army has in history, and therefore it is using that mechanism and that framework as part of its strategy to survive. Let me be clear, Hamas's main aim here is to survive to see another day. That's why I talk about encouraging Hamas in these circumstances being so diabolical for the Palestinians who are undoubtedly suffering under them in Gaza. So far as reforms are concerned, the difficulty is, of course, that when you are dealing with terrorist groups, you cannot subject them to the standard censor in the international legal arena. Sanctions won't necessarily work, although, when you're dealing with a state terror actor like Iran, they certainly do and ought to be deployed. But so far as Hamas, Hezbollah, or even the Houthis are concerned, unfortunately, it is military action alone that can seek to defeat the terrorist entity, rather than, say, convince them that there is something to be gained for them by complying with international law. So I'm afraid reform wouldn't strike me as particularly conducive to convincing terrorist organisations that they need to amend their ways.
And does that go for example, where we see Hamas leaders and wanting to hold them accountable? Is there any mechanism under international law that they could be held accountable for the atrocities?
There is a mechanism under Israeli law, and in fact there are many discussions at the moment of the appropriate means and method of trying the Nukhba terrorists of the 7th of October and those also who've been detained subsequently. The difficulty with an international mechanism is that, frankly, so far as Israel is concerned, and I say this trying to put myself in their shoes so much as possible, when one sees, and we come back to this point on the weaponization of international law being upended and abused to such an extent against the only Jewish state, I don't think there can be any confidence that an international court or tribunal can be properly relied upon with respect to any issue where Israel is concerned. And the International Criminal Court is a case in point here. It also has no jurisdiction over the Hamas terrorists. And the single warrant that it issued against a dead man, Mohammed Daif, as some sort of grotesque pretense of holding both sides accountable, which in and of itself seeks to draw an equivalence between the only democracy in the Middle East and a terrorist organisation that's internationally prescribed. When we see even what the International Criminal Court has done, I think it really behoves Israel to treat any international initiative in that regard with some degree of suspicion and perhaps even angst.
Thank you.
May I ask Alex if you could ask the last questions and then we'll move on.
Thank you. So firstly, I take your claim that the IDF has the highest standards of IHL for any army in history as outrageous. Having particularly served in the British military myself I think that is a particularly staggering claim. I would like to ask about international humanitarian law again and aid deliveries. So 91% of people in Gaza are facing food insecurity. 1/3 of hospitals there are completely out of action, with the other 2/3 damaged already by the fighting. 92% of housing units have been destroyed or damaged. And there's now 50 days that no aid deliveries have been accepted into Gaza. And in fact, Israeli ministers have declared they are blocking aid, in particular to exert pressure on Hamas. This is, from my opinion, and almost every aid agency in the world, a clear breach of international humanitarian law. I wonder how you think Israel is justifying this.
First of all, with reference to the highest humanitarian standards applied by the IDF, it's not just from me. I think you've had Colonel Richard Kemp, certainly at other parliamentary committees, testifying, John Spencer, the head of urban armed conflict at West Point in America, and there are certainly the members of the military expert panel that I went into Gaza with, who would give very similar testimony. But we'll have to agree to disagree on that. I approach this as an international lawyer looking specifically at the application of IHL. So far as the aid issue is concerned, the statistics on this, I'm afraid, have been consistently misrepresented. So far, across the operation period of, this is before the ceasefire, there was 1.1% of trucks that came from the international community to aid crossing points that Israel refused to allow into Gaza. That was it, because they were either dual-use items or because the aid organisation in question didn't allow a search to be conducted. Now, those searches...
It's about the current blockade, not what...
Well, let's be clear, because the reports that you referred to were also erroneous, and in fact many of them predicting famine in Gaza, and that have been used to justify the false accusations of starvation as a weapon of war.
Given how little time we have, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could just answer Alex's question.
Answer, I'm afraid.
Answer the question that you've been asked, if you don't mind, given that we are already running over time.
Right.
You've been asked specifically about aid not getting in at the moment, and you're talking about another period of time, which is in itself contentious, and we don't have time to get into that argument. What we're asking, the question that you were asked was very precise and carefully put, and I would greatly appreciate it. In the few moments that we have left, if you could answer it.
The question I was asked referenced in reports of international bodies which have erroneously predicted famine and starvation in Gaza. And in fact, I link in our submission to your report separately we have done on those aid reports and on the famine review that we've conducted, which I would ask the committee to consider, because the IPC report in particular was called out by the Famine Review Committee as being based on only impartial information and being implausible in its predictions. Now, that is significant to answer your question on what aid organisations have reported. Those allegations, I'm afraid, are false, and you only need to look at the volume of aid that has gone in.
Are the blockade in place at the moment?
I'll come to that in a moment, if I will. There were several parts to your question. One only has to look at the volume of aid that has gone in, which is publicly available on COGAT statistics on their website. And the subsequent analysis of the calorific content of that aid, which in the 7 months that were analysed, January to July last year, found that over 3,000 calories per person per day had gone into Gaza, which is significantly in excess of NHS guidelines. That is the position before going into the ceasefire. As part of the ceasefire, aid was flooded into the Gaza Strip, so that even international humanitarian organisations have agreed that there were many, many months of aid available in the Gaza Strip, so that the subsequent seizure of aid going in as part of an attempt to put pressure on Hamas. Let me be clear. Hamas has been stealing the aid, selling it on the black market, and using those funds to fuel its war machine against Israel. So that is the reason for the aid being turned off, on the basis that the civilian population have sufficient because of the flooding of Gaza with humanitarian aid over the course of the ceasefire. I hope that answers your question.
So your position is, despite the UN's reports that over 90% of people in Gaza face food insecurity last week, it's acceptable to conduct this blockade because there was lots of aid delivered in the past.
So the UN reports, and that's why it's important that I address them, have been consistently found to be wrong. And I ask you to look at the numbers, the data that has gone in, and the analysis of the calorific content. If there are indeed individuals facing food insecurity in Gaza, then there is a very clear reason for that, and that is Hamas's diversion of aid, because the total volume that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip by Israel is far in excess of what is required by individual Gazans. Hamas has been stealing the aid, but also, I mentioned they were shooting civilians. That includes shooting civilians that were seeking to obtain some of that aid that was being brought in by international organisations. That is the true tragedy here, which in some sense brings us full circle, that if the United Kingdom's policy is to continue, I'm afraid, to encourage Hamas, and Anthony Blinken did actually, in a moment of great honesty, reference America's part in encouraging Hamas. Every time there was criticism of Israel, Hamas would walk away from hostage negotiations. That is, I think, a very important message for this committee to internalise, to include in its report, and to feed back to the government in terms of building a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for coming in and for fighting back. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming in today.
What a BS committee. What a BS committee this is. Well, you're not giving enough food to the Gazans. Have you seen the Hamas fighters? Have you seen the absolute stomachs on these people? Have you seen anybody in Gaza really starving? I see videos coming out of Gaza of people in the grocery store mocking Israel for giving them food. We're look at us. We're 100% fine, and you're giving us your food. Like, Israel is the Gazans' people only hope. The Palestinians' only hope is Israel, and the entire world is fighting against Israel. It's almost like a mother trying to take care of somebody else's children, and the government is trying to criticize that mother for not doing it well enough. Like, imagine adopting, because we're not responsible for these Palestinians, but we have taken responsibility for them, and yet the entire international community is like, well, you're not feeding them well enough. You're not giving them enough electricity. Like, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. You want to help the Gazans? Go and help them. Like, we have no problem with you going and dropping aid, whether it be from the sky or whether it be from getting Gazans out. Why don't you take in some Gazans? Why don't you take in the 2 million Palestinians that we took into Israel? Israel took in 2 million Arabs, 2 million so-called Palestinians, as the UN Relief Works Agency calls them Palestinians for some reason, because they'll never be regular citizens until they're returned, until the right of return in Israel is destroyed. This is insanity. And she exposed them all, especially like the end, like the laugh. It reminded me of Umbridge in Harry Potter. For more, subscribe to the channel. If you want to help us make more of these videos, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.